Hello, folks. I think that's recording now. Yes, welcome to this re-record of the BSBI Scotland Conference final presentation. Not sure exactly how far through the rest of the conference we got with those recordings, but hopefully you'll be able to go and view all of the rest of them now there, which ones have needed to be re-recorded. Sadly, it's not live. Would have probably been better with the questions and stuff, but nonetheless, you can get the gist of what I'm going to be talking about here. I am Sam, Senior Ecological Advisor for Scotland. I work for Plantlife. Do a bit of an intro in a moment. And I'm going to talk today a bit about kind of learning from our Cairngorms project, which finished back in August, particularly talking about two pinewood specialist species. So first of all, really briefly, I imagine you've all heard of Plantlife before. Plantlife conservation charity working for plants and fungi. We manage reserves across the UK, but most of our work is via IPAs, which are both signed around the UK and around the world. I say IPAs and IFAs. That's important plant areas and important fungi areas. Basically, we've done a lot of work with other organisations as well to kind of assign areas of the UK and the world, which are very important for rare species, valuable communities, and vital habitats for plants and fungi. And a lot of our project work ends up being around those areas. We also have a lot of policy and advocacy work where we try and impact government policy and other agencies and input onto work like that for plants and fungi. So today I am going to be talking, as I mentioned, about the Cairngorms Rare Plants and Wild Connections project and kind of learning from that project. So it was HLF funded project from 2020 to 2024. There's some really lovely evaluation stuff out there now, which if you're curious, you can go check out. So this link up there, I don't usually put links on a presentation. It's not very helpful, is it? But it's short enough. You might be able to type it in, which is a link to a rather nice story map that we prepped, kind of summarizes all of the project, which you'll see a little bit of here, but it's the whole thing, and you also have nice pictures and other information as well. So it's really worth a look and a share around if you're interested. There's also some lovely stuff on our YouTube. I strongly recommend checking out Plantlife YouTube, going back to see the old twin flower film, which we did, which was really lovely with a partnership with a film student who's looking at doing wildlife photography filming. She did an amazing job. Anyway, the kind of five areas the project worked on. We worked on meadows, so we're still working with 4 farmers to trial mob grazing and monitor the impacts of mob grazing on species richness in the Upper Strathspey. On mountaintops, we did a really interesting project partnering with James Hutton Institute, looking at mountaintop fungi, surveying, I think, all but one of the Munros in Cairngorms National Park. Found some really interesting stuff like some new species, new to the UK records, and even a new species of fungi detected by the DNA, which is really, really exciting. James Hutton have gone on to publish that and expand that survey across all of Scotland as well, which is really nice. We also looked at waxcap grasslands, doing surveys of a few new sites using the waxcap app to assess kind of all of the Cairngorms, and kind of doing advocacy stuff on that front. But what I'm going to talk about today, and the main kind of a lot of our time was spent on twin flower and one flowered wintergreen. So I'll start with one flower wintergreen. This one's quite close to my heart because I spent a lot of time working on it. Kind of, no one's ever really worked on one flower wintergreen as far as I'm aware. Happy to be corrected on that. Or people have looked at it, but no one's ever really taken a significant amount of time, you know, a focus for a project or anything across the world, as far as I'm aware. Yeah, so it was kind of a bit of an adventure getting into it for this project, or the project which has just ended. We are continuing on it now as well. Trying to figure out what needs to be done, what's caused the decline, stuff like that. So yeah, it's highlighted in decline and need of study. Basically, at the beginning of the project, we know that there was a decline, but we didn't know what was causing it. Recorded it disappearing from sites, so it was really trying to figure out what we can do, whether we could do translocations to rescue it, that sort of thing. So there's a lot not known about one flower wintergreen, but we are aware that it's a partial mycoheterotroph, which means that at least to some extent, it depends upon fungi and gets some of its energy, some of its sugars and such from fungi as well as other nutrients. That's particularly important in germination. We're now aware that there's a very close relationship to germinating seeds, and they might spend a year or two getting the fungal relationships in the soil before they germinate. Similar to orchids, if you're familiar with how orchids germinate. there's a if it's either going to be in the main recording or a separate recording, but Jenny Baker did a really good talk earlier in the conference about a kind of partner project we're working with RBG on to look at the fungal relationships that Meneses depends on, and how kind of how that works. So what specific species, or if it's kind of a broader community, and how that works with the seedling development, for example. So that's a really important part of this this conservation project as well. But basically, we know they're declining, we know they're disappearing from sites, but it's very difficult to identify exactly what's causing the decline. So they're linked to mature Scots pine woodlands. A lot of old literature will discuss how you find them in mature and old Scots pine. We know that the fungi they associate with are often ectomycorrhizal fungi that associate with pine woodlands. And so there's a link there to pine woods and the soils and the conditions in pine woods. However, you often see them at much younger sites. So you can see here on this map that they're doing really quite well at a few coastal sites. So there's 3 sites along the coast there in plantations, some of which are less than 100 years old. I think 100 to 150 years old, all 3 of those plantations. So they're relatively newly planted sites. Before that, there weren't pine woodland at all. Whereas the kind of old growth pine woodlands, into Abernethy, for example, down in the Cairngorms and over into Glenafric in the west, they seem to be going extinct, locally extinct anyway. We're not quite sure because I have looked at nearly all these sites now, but it's very difficult to be confident that you've definitely spotted what was there. So worth noting, if any keen plant owners out there would like to go have another look at these sites, that would be great. But you can see the numbers in the yellow dots there are where they still are, and they've all been surveyed in the last year or so, so they're pretty accurate numbers. I think the Colburn number actually probably needs to go up a bit now. I've surveyed it just a few months ago, weeks ago, I should say. And all of the red dots, the date there is when they were last recorded. So they're all quite small populations when they were last recorded, and they may have gone extinct. This pattern appears to be mirrored on the continent, so as I say, it's not been studied a lot, but there was a paper published in 2022 in Sweden where they'd seen an 80% local extinction at sites in just 7 years that they'd surveyed, which is quite shocking. So perhaps this is kind of a large-scale decline, even though it's not recorded as being rare on the mainland. It's quite well distributed across the Northern Hemisphere. It might well be declining everywhere, and we're quite at risk of losing our Scottish population. So what is going on? Why is it declining? It's a really challenging question to answer. Most literature, as I've said, suggests it's associated with old growth pinewood, but it's doing very well at coastal sites, or at least appears to be doing very well at coastal sites. Worth saying, it's still a little questionable how well it's doing because we have seen it not flowering, for example. The biggest population doesn't appear to have flowered in 2 years for whatever reason, so that's kind of confusing. It also seems to be very locally habitat dependent, so I suspect there's something going on the coast where microclimates under the pinewood, where the mist comes in, is perhaps quite good for it, and up in the hills it's struggling a bit more. It's worth saying there's also a lot of question about how the health of these sites on the coast, because they may well have been colonized by quite small populations, and we know that Meneses, it's clonal and it quite easily spreads clonally, so it might well be that even though there's 10,000 individual rosettes, there may only be a few thousand or even less than 1,000 distinct genetic individuals, and they may be very, very closely related as well. So we need to investigate that as well, those sites. So the best picture we've got so far of exactly what they need, it seems to be they're very disturbance dependent. So if you go to a lot of coastal sites, you see them growing along forestry tracks. Where there's been clear disturbance along the tracks and such. You won't see them, more than 10 meters from the forest track. They'll be quite densely packed on the track itself. Equally, you tend to see them when they are still in kind of old growth pine woodlands in the uplands. You'll see them along deer trails, along areas that have otherwise been disturbed, sometimes along loch shores as well. It seems to be ground that is kind of otherwise disturbed by something. But it's not just that they're dependent on kind of an opening and not being overcompeted, because you will often find them right underneath dense heather. So it seems to be, in my opinion, more about the ground disturbance itself, possibly in relation to seed germination, than it is about having enough open light. And that is very much linked to the ectomycorrhizal fungi, as I mentioned there as well. I think there's probably something to do with how wood is rotting in the soil. You often find them among brush piles as well. I suspect that's probably because the fungi are doing really well there, and that's allowed seed germination. And as I mentioned earlier, canopy and microclimate I think is really important. You'll often find them on the north side of trees, or they'll be in an open area, but where trees are to the north, so they're sheltered, if you see what I mean. You won't usually find them in full sun unless they're really in somewhere very wet. They can actually survive quite wet spots, so you can find them in very dry soil or completely submerged in water for long periods as well. So quite variable, the soil conditions. Kind of running under the theory they're quite a mobile species, quite a colonizer species. They probably don't persist at sites for a very long time. They kind of move into a site when it's disturbed. Populations seem to fluctuate quite rapidly year on year, and then they may move out when a population persists, when the kind of, for example, disturbance moved on, the canopy's matured, that sort of thing. Just to give some examples of where we've been recording it. So this is Wonderflower Wintergreen in the Cairngorms National Park. This is in Old Granton Wood, just north of Granton, one of the two remaining Cairngorms populations. It was declining heavily underneath rhododendron in 2014, 2015, and then the rhododendron was removed 2014, 15-ish, I should say, before that point. And the population started to increase significantly from 2016 onwards. It was only properly so in 2016, but you can see this huge increase in 2017 there. And then it slowly declined since then. I think that huge increase was due to that massive disturbance. So you could see it colonizing all the disturbed ground, all the kind of rotting rhododendron wood. It was quite obvious and visible on site. But the site's quite open now because the rhododendron's been removed, and I think it's probably a bit too open and getting dry, and the population's now struggling a bit. May also be a genetic bottleneck in there that's causing part of the problem. Interestingly, you can see 2016, 2017, 2018 there. You've got the flowering coming through. So 2016, 2017, younger plants developing, and then 2018, the kind of mature plants with the flower heads. 2019 was almost half the population was flowering. So you can kind of see how the age structure moving through there. We don't know exactly how long they live. It needs to be studied a bit more, but from kind of some of the records I've got here, I'd say 4 to 5 years seems probably accurate, with maybe a year or so underground or not visible while they're germinating in effect. The other site, which I'll touch on a bit because we did a translocation there, is Abernethy, which was had a similar sort of pattern. It was very heavily grazed in 2020, and then in 2022, rosettes reappeared substantially. 21 it actually disappeared completely. We were worried it was gone, but I think that was probably developing very young seedlings. In 2022, we saw an explosion of the population and significant amounts of flowering, and now it's reduced again in 23, 24. So it seems to be a real spike and a positive reaction to hefty disturbance, quite significant disturbance on site. So we have been trialing management. So we've been discussing RSPB have started grazing reliably on the Wildflower Wintergreen site at Abernethy. And they're now going to be doing a kind of 4-year intermittent grazing schedule there with cattle on site, which is really, really nice. We've also trialed the translocation. This translocation was very much experimental to see if it can be done with Wildflower Wintergreen. Quite a lot of populations are threatened by, for example, coastal erosion. We've also had clear fell, unfortunately. Not that I want to advocate for moving a species to allow clear fell, but sometimes it's unavoidable. And because we've got so few populations left, having the option to move populations into a safe site is really good to know it's there, effectively. But equally, we want to know if we can translocate to allow genetic mixing between populations, because we don't currently know genetic relatedness, and that is something we're going to be doing this year. So after we've assessed that, hopefully we'll have a clearer picture of exactly how inbred different populations are. Is, for example, the Balblow Wood, the northern largest population of 15,000, quite varied, or is it very inbred? Even though there's a lot of rosettes, is there a lot of clonal reproduction going on there and not much kind of seed reproduction? So yeah, once we've got an idea of that, we might well do more translocations as well. It's worth noting, you can see in the graph there, I would say the translocation so far has been a success. So this is percentage on the left, so 100% when we planted them out, were surviving. And we've monitored it for 12 months now, so October was 12 months. Obviously, you always just expect a decline in number of plants when you translocate something. So at 9 months, that was in the summer. Again, somewhat what I would expect. The population was declining because I think the summer is their greatest period of stress when they're getting dry, usually. But at 12 months, the population increased. We saw new seedlings developing, probably ones that were already in the soil developing, because I think that seed germination is probably a 2-year process, or if you see what I mean, it's more than a year after first germination before they appear. So they were probably already developing in the soil. You can see those plots there with Jenny holding them in those chunks of soil that we moved when we moved them. So yeah, really good to trial our SPB Abernethy, and gives us a lot of options moving forward. And hopefully through kind of this translocation work, this genetic work, and figuring out the Pinewood Association in partnership with RBG, Pinewood Fungi Associations in partnership with RBG, we'll really get a good picture of what needs to be done moving forward for one-flower wintergreen, and possibly be doing many more translocations into 2026 and beyond, maybe into those old sites where it's gone extinct as well, alongside management improvements. Yes, I know I don't really need to sell doing this sort of thing for one-flower wintergreen, but it's always nice to be able to say we're working on a species like this, but we're working on it as part of a whole pinewoods community. So the decline in one-flower wintergreen is kind of an indicator for a potential problem among many microheterotrophic species, such as all the pyrolas, the other wintergreens, which are all declining as far as I understand, and also potentially a decline in pinewoods soil fungi, which is very, very important as well. So we can kind of use them as an indicator for that and potentially address that problem as well. Anyway, that's one-flower wintergreen. But also touch a little bit on twin-flower, Linnea borealis, the other pinewood specialist we've been working on. I'm sure it needs no introduction. Probably our best-known pinewood specialist flower. It's had quite the decline in the UK, despite having quite a lot of interest, although arguably because of all the interest that's been the interest in its conservation lately, it's on the up now, I would say. It's not as picky as one-flower wintergreen. It's actually quite easy in comparison. I suppose part of that ease is because it's been studied a lot more, and a lot of people have already done work on it. Like I say, it's a bit solid as a rock, really, because you can get sites where people have a big twin flower patch and then forestry vehicles come in and wreck it all and drive all over it, and you get people getting in touch with us saying, "Oh, it's all gone, it's terrible," and you're like, actually, it'll be fine. It'll probably come back happier next year. It's tough little thing. Anyway, it's had a kind of gradual decline in Scotland over probably centuries, in relation to kind of changes to pine mold management and just reductions of pine woods. Really threatened by clearfell. So the problem is you end up with, because twin flower simply can't survive clearfell forestry management, so you end up with tiny patches, relic patches in the corners that haven't been, commercially viable to fell, which is usually only a single clone, because that was just the one that survived whatever happened. And so these single clones are separated by a mile or two even, and the pollinators can only travel a very short distance, so they simply cannot be cross-pollinated. So that's the issue we know of. Just a few stats. We know it's self-incompatible, or primarily self-incompatible. Forest Research, this graph is Forest Research as well, a lovely paper by Richard Enos, we don't think it can produce much, if any, viable seed via self-fertilization, and the pollination distance of the hoverflies which pollinate it is quite short. So in a small study by Forest Research, again, it looks like it's at 25 meters is kind of the optimal distance, so not very far. So if you've got several hundred meters between different patches, it's unlikely they're going to be cross-pollinated. And in many cases, there's not contiguous pine woodland between those as well, which makes it even worse, because you can imagine the pollinators aren't very inclined to fly across the middle of a farm to get to another twin flower patch, for example. So just, to give you some numbers, 123 patches which were studied in the Cairngorms, only 16% sported genetically distinct individuals. So the vast majority of those are single clone patches which cannot reproduce. Yeah, so this is just a real ballpark number. Please don't quote this, but just to give you an idea of the sort of threat we might be facing, there may be as few as 500 genetically distinct individuals across Scotland. It could be 1,000, it could be more. It's very much a ballpark. It's probably not more than several thousand, and it may be less than 500. I'm just basing that on this quite comprehensive study by Forest Research, which basically assessed that there's several hundred in the Cairngorms from the study, probably more that they missed. But given that the majority of twinflower we believe is in the Cairngorms, you get the picture. It's not a big population, and although the area of land covered by twinflower is much larger than one-flower wintergreen, the genetic situation is potentially quite worrying in comparison. I say potentially because one-flower wintergreen may also be in a bad state. We don't actually know yet. But anyway, Andy Scobie pioneered a lot of the twinflower work, and he is now he has led on the twinflower translocation work, which a lot of people have now taken up the mantle of. And so that's what we've been doing. So in my book, twinflower is the absolute ideal case for twinflower translocation. It is very resilient, can be collected from cuttings because it grows with kind of quite aerial roots. You can easily take cuttings from a patch. You can easily take quite a lot of cuttings from a patch without really impacting it because they grow and spread via stolons all over the place if you've seen a twinflower patch. And then when you plant it out, it grows on really well. If you grow it on tubs like that, you'll see it, quadruple in quantity in 6 months to a year easily. Sometimes we've had twinflower pouring out of the buckets. We've had too much that we know what to do with. And people love twinflower. It's really appealing. It's a really easy sell, to be honest, compared to a species like one-flower wintergreen, or God forbid some of our mosses touch the poor things. Twinflower is really, really favourable for people to work on effectively. Yeah, so alongside kind of the translocation, obviously we're also talking about habitat management, and again, sort of linking to what we've looked at with one-flower wintergreen. It's less specifically disturbance dependent in the soil, but they do struggle with competition. So dominance of heather and labrum, which you will often see in undisturbed pine woodlands, is a real problem for twinflower. Mature twinflower can survive, but it won't thrive, and given a long time, it will gradually decline in that habitat. But the big problem is it cannot set seed. So without open space, without more disturbed environments around a twinflower patch, we're not going to have the recruitment of new seed, even if it is being produced by a patch. So disturbance alongside translocation and changes to pine woodland management is very important as well. Yeah, so as I say, this is the translocation that we've done. So many other people have been doing translocation as well. So Cairngorms Connect have been monitoring and continuing Andy's work. Mar Lodge down up above Ballater there have been doing a lot of good translocation work, as well as Balmoral Estate. Many other folks have been doing it as well, which is lovely. We did 10 translocations, so we translocated 960 twinflower cuttings across 10 sites, collected from 30 sites, so there's a nice genetic diversity across all of our translocation plots there. So there's 6 different clones at each site, so plenty of material to reproduce. And each of those red stars is where we've planted them out, and blue crosses are where we collected from. So there's 4 of them, although they're a bit squashed together, down in Glentana down there, and 6, 3 near Carbridge, 1 at Botogan, 1 at Branton, and 1 at Glenlivet. Yeah, so that's kind of our twinflower and one-flower wintergreens work we have been doing. Just really quickly, I won't spend too long on this, but just to give you a bit of what we're doing now. So we've kind of expanded out of the Cairngorms, which is rather nice because, plants don't have hard boundaries, as you've seen with the one-flower wintergreen. The vast majority of one-flower wintergreen is outside of the Cairngorms National Park. So it's been really nice to be able to work across the kind of whole Central Highlands region now. So we now have a new NRF-funded project looking at 4 species. So we're continuing our work on Linnea meneses, but we're also starting to work on tufted saxifrage and aspen bristle moss, Saxifraga cespitosa, and Niholmiella gymnostoma. So this is very much a scoping phase, figuring out what we can do for these species. All of them are under threat. Most are vulnerable or endangered, I think, other than twinflower, yes. And this is just a year kind of NRF-funded scoping phase where we're just figuring out what needs to be done next. So for example, for Twinflower, we're supporting, strategizing, producing documents, looking at whether we can establish a nursery in Strathspey, but developing it effectively, developing data resources. One Flower Wintergreen is going to be continued research and developing. They're doing this genetic study. Tufted saxifrage, we've building on work that was done in Wales, because we have pioneered the conservation of the last remaining tufted saxifrage population right on the mountain tops at Snowdon in Wales. And now we're looking to work on the 7, 8. It's a bit variable depending how many actually still exist. Something like 8 populations of tufted saxifrage that are in Scotland or on mountain peaks. We need to survey those first of all to figure out how many of them still exist. Hopefully most, if not all of them, and then pose what work can be done, whether translocation, for example, might be done, or something else may be the right way forward for the conservation of tufted saxifrage. It's worth saying that was arguably a little bit of a hard sell sometimes, I think, to Nature Scott and other conservation funders, because climate change is seen as such a massive threat for any of the true Arctic alpine species. And I think the case we made to put it on this NRF bid, partly we've done work on it before and we know that it can work. We've had a lot of success in Wales, but also, I know, again, I'm preaching to the choir, none of you would argue against this, but just for information, species such as Arctic alpines, which we think are on the edge of their range in the UK, we shouldn't just abandon them because of the threat of climate change. We should study and investigate what can be done based on predictive modeling, based on current understanding of habitats, based on what is likely to happen on these sites in future. I don't think it's fair to just abandon any species, and we should at least study and investigate what we should do, what we can do. Now, that might conclude it's not efficient to conserve these species. I don't want to say that, and I hope we won't say that, but that is always an option because we have limited conservation resources. And finally, aspen bristle moss, an assessment of remaining population of Scotland. So it's only known from 3 sites. It was actually believed to be extinct, I think back in 2000 or 99 or something, but it was refound at 3 sites. This is an aspen bark specialist, so it does do very well. The population is focused around the Cairngorms National Park, where most of our more dense aspen stands in the UK really are. There's a few other patches there in other places, but kind of what we're really looking to do with that is to figure out exactly how under-recorded the species is, to be honest, and then kind of get a brief assessment of kind of where we need to go, what can be done to help with aspen bristle moss. That's what we're doing now, and hopefully much future work incoming. But yeah, just to kind of summarize more from the habitats nature kind of overall conclusion side, and to return to the title, An Inch of Moss, I'm sure you're kind of curious about where I was going with that. It occurred to me the most succinct way while prepping this talk to kind of explain what I would like to see more in pine woods and what is a kind of good management guide for pine woods is an inch of moss. So Twinflower and Wintergreen, and broadly kind of all of these pine wood specialists and vasculars in general. I mean, you'll hear people say when you have grazing in a woodland compared to dense heather and blaeberry growth, you'll see vascular plants thrive and come up. Now, that is a very nuanced, that is a very unnuanced view, I should say. Obviously, we have massive problems with overgrazing in the vast majority of Scotland, and reducing grazing is vital. But if we deer-fence a woodland and then leave it, we're not going to get a high diversity of plants. If you did that around a one-flower wintergreen site, I would be absolutely mad. You know, that's a terrible idea for many of these understory species. So we need a hybrid approach where we kind of reduce grazing, but we also introduce supplementary grazing of cattle, for example, or other species to combine with the deer grazing. And that's really what we're going for. So we're looking for patches of moss. So we want not the whole woodland to look like it. We're happy with lots of lovely bits of heather and all sorts of stuff, but a very varied habitat that maintains a kind of thin layer, just an inch of moss in some places, without having to have dense, heavy shading and without having to have really dense grazing. That kind of nice middle, that dynamism of habitat where you've got kind of connectivity between different habitats, and you've got naturally varied age structure of pine woods that maintain varied habitats. Within them, an inch of moss, creating a niche for these species. Yeah, So I think that's kind of a neat summary. I feel like I've repeated myself a little bit there, but you get the feeling, you know. So that's more or less the end of my talk. Thank you very much for listening. I'd say any questions in the question mark there. Unfortunately, I can't give you answer to any questions you may be asking at the screen now on a recording, but I hope you enjoyed that talk, and feel free to email me if you're interested in any more of this, or you'd like to get in touch and query anything you've heard in this presentation. I'll happily happily discuss. So yeah, thank you very much, and take care, everyone.